Right, and we are go. Well, welcome everybody to this short presentation about creating an EP. This presentation is for staff who are involved in the PBRF process and are going to be putting together an evidence portfolio. Okay, so the purpose of the presentation is to provide an overview of the quality evaluation process, to provide some information about creating an EP, and to address some common myths or misconceptions and answer some questions. We know that there's a wide range of PBRF experience out there in the sector, and this presentation is really pitched at those who've got limited or no experience or had no involvement in the quality evaluation before. The information here is of a general nature. If you want specific determinations or advice, you should check with the person who's managing your PBRF quality evaluation at your TEO, and that's your key person. And just as a little rider, the information here does not replace any that's given in our published guidelines. Okay, so what we're going to cover, an overview of the quality evaluation or QE, a short mention of new and emerging researchers, and then we'll go over the sections in the EP to be completed. We'll give some final advice and then some useful resources. Okay, I'm just going to, my name's Sharon Beattie, by the way, and I have with me, so I'm the communications and support person for PBRF, and I have with me Amber Flynn, who's the program manager, and I'm just going to pass over to Amber now, who's going to talk you through the main steps in the quality evaluation process.
Okay, so we've developed a little guide to help staff members at TEOs understand the relationship between them, their TEO or their employer, and the TEC. So one of the first things that is involved in the quality evaluation process is that TEOs do need to assess their staff and determine who is eligible. So the criteria is based on being based in New Zealand, the employment dates, so the length of the person's contract and their full-time equivalent, their role and their contract. So your TEO will determine if you're eligible or not, and they will also determine whether you have a portfolio that is likely to be funded. So your role as a staff member is to contribute to the preparation of your portfolio, and you'll do that in line with your TEO's internal processes. And your key person will be, again, the person who you need to talk to about those processes. So once that's all done, the TEO will submit the evidence portfolio and staff data to the TEC, and we do this through an IT system specifically designed for this process. The TEC's role in this is actually the administration of the overall process and the assessment of those EPs. We do this with 13 peer review panels. So the TEC also audits the information that is provided by your organisation, and one of the things that you may need to do is actually provide your organisation with some additional information that supports that audit process. So once all of the portfolios are assessed, the TEC will provide the TEO with the quality category results, and as part of that, that's where the PBRF funding comes from. And the TEO then provides their staff with the confidential quality evaluation result. However, as a staff member, you can also request detailed information on your assessment from the TEC. So there is a connection directly between the TEC and you as a staff member, but the key relationship is between you and your organisation.
Right, thanks for that, Amber. That's me again. Just a few words about the new and emerging researcher category. So the goal of this category is to allow staff members who are starting research careers just starting research careers to be recognised and funded under the PBRF. It's not about being young, it's nothing to do with age, it's about the point in career. And just a little word on that funding. So just to be clear, the funding goes to the TEO. Researchers themselves don't receive the funding. The second thing, the eligibility principle, the key principle here is that a staff member is undertaking substantive and independent research for the first time in their career. So we know that there may be quite a few of you who are listening to this who fall into this category. I guess the main message is that you need to talk to your research person, your PBRF person, to understand and determine whether or not you do meet the criteria for new and emerging. Now, the category relates only to R and C NE categories. So you can be a new and emerging and you can get an A and a B, and you have to meet the same quality standards as everybody else does. There is the one research output minimum requirement. There have been some questions about independent research too, and I'll just pass them on over to you, Amber. And there's been some questions around research outputs that were like completed while somebody was doing a PhD, for example, and it goes to the sort of our definition of research and independent research. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I guess, as you said, the minimum requirement for research outputs is that there is one NRO, and that NRO does need to meet the definition of research, and it needs to be substantive and independent research under that definition. So, that's one of the reasons why if you're a new and emerging researcher and you have a thesis, you do need to provide one other research output. So it's slightly different. If you're not a new and emerging researcher, you do just provide that one minimum, substantive independent piece of research.
Right. And if people had produced output in the course of a PhD, working with a supervisor, for example, would that be automatically deemed not independent?
No, each piece of research does need to be looked at as to the relationship between the, either the co-producer or the co-authors, if there are. So that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I mean, for example, you could have someone who is a fully independent researcher producing their work. They also happen to be doing a PhD at the same time. It doesn't automatically mean that every piece of research that they've done is independent or is not independent.
Right.
They do need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, that's helpful because I know some people have been a little bit unclear about that. We've had a couple of questions actually around PhDs. So one was, I just finished a PhD, does that automatically make me a new and emerging researcher? And the second question, do I have to have a PhD to be a new and emerging researcher?
Yeah, so there has been previously some conflation between new and emerging researchers and PhDs. So really the answer to both of these is no. If you look at the new and emerging criteria, there is no criteria which outlines that you have to have a PhD or not have one. So it is just purely around, have you completed substantive and independent research for the first time in your career? And so that is the key consideration there. So as I said before, someone could be a fully independent researcher and then happens to do their PhD because that's, what they've decided to do, and again, they may not even have a PhD at all, but they're still doing substantive and independent research.
So we just don't want people to conflate those two things.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you. Right.
So, I mean, I guess this is where a question for you then, Sharon, is when it comes to actually completing the different sections of a portfolio, is there any kind of general advice that people should take into account?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to think about when you're putting together your EP, your audience. So these EPs, of course, are assessed by panels, and panel members have a lot of EPs to look at. So keep your descriptions clear and concise. don't bury key information about you and your research. So you're telling us your story. Do it clearly, precisely, reasonably briefly if you can. You don't have to use all the characters in the fields. They are fairly generous, but it's a bit like the road limit. You don't have to drive at 100 k's. It's just a suggestion. Explain how the components, that's the research outputs and the research contributions, connect, and avoid repetition, I'd say. Okay, the parts of the EP. Amber, do you want to talk through this briefly?
Yeah, so this diagram sets out the different parts of the EP in terms of the sections that have to be completed. Obviously we've identified in blue the ones that are mandatory, and the ones in beige are the optional sections, so they don't have to be completed for a portfolio to actually go through to the assessment process. But each of those is an important section, and we'll talk about that more as we go through. Yeah,
sure. Okay, so the first part is just sort of, I guess it's a little bit the housekeeping stuff. So we've got the EP and the researcher details, the EP identifier, confidential research, the release permission, whether the quality category is going to the researcher, and then under that, so that's the EP details. Under the researcher details is the NSN, name, and date of birth. So in this part here, I guess what's important, what's really needs to be on top for researchers is this here, the confidential research. So these are outputs that are not in the public domain in a traditional sense, although it should be noted that the research is considered to be in the public domain when it's accepted by its commissioner. But essentially what researchers need to know, that they should flag outputs like this so that we, the TEC, can manage them with the proper process and to show that permission's been received as well. Anything else there? I don't think so.
No, I mean, most of these things are going to be managed by your organisation anyway. So, so really, the key thing is that check the details when they come through.
And just by way of reassurance as well, just back to that confidential research, all the panel members and chairs and everybody who comes into contact with the EP, of course, signs confidentiality agreements with us.
Okay, so the next section that is probably a very key section is around the panel details. So what do staff members who are doing these EPs need to know here, Sharon?
Right. Okay, so in this section, the researcher needs to put down the primary panel that the EP is going to, the primary subject area of research, the field of research description, and we'll move on to that in a minute. So just going back to the field of research description. So here, this information should be brief, but the purpose is to help the chair to assign your EP to panel members. So the field should focus on the content of the NROs, and if you undertake interdisciplinary research, you should also clearly identify the key areas that are covered here. So for example, it might be something like the research in 2 NROs relates to veterinary microbiology and public health. So it's just giving the chair a heads up that there may be crossover there. And so this information is really important because it helps the chair to assign your EP to the correct panel member. Okay, the next point here is, does it contain Māori research for cross-referral to the Māori Knowledge and Development Panel? Or does it contain Pacific research for cross-referral to the Pacific Research Panel? And here you would, if that is the case, then you need to put in a rationale and comment about this, and you also need to reference which components you are referring for cross-referral. Yeah, you need to be specific here, and if you think that you can't identify the component that makes it a candidate for cross-referencing, then you probably should be going straight to those panels. Is that right, Amber?
Well, or if there's nothing in there, you shouldn't be.
Or nothing at all.
Yeah,
exactly. Right. All right. I think that's it for that. Amber, a question about panels. Well, two actually. The first one is, how do I choose the right panel?
Yep. So how do you choose the right panel is a very common question.
Yes, it is.
I mean, there are 13 peer review panels, and they do cover, very specific subject areas. And so it's really important that you look at the panel-specific guidelines and look at the areas that that panel expects to see. And of course, the main guidelines do also state that the majority of your research outputs should actually align to that panel. So, I mean, those are the two sort of basic things to look for when you are selecting a panel.
And obviously, talk to the person in your research office about it as well. Okay, and there was a second question, and then how will the TC ensure that the panels have the right expertise to assess EPs?
Yeah. So in February, we're expecting TEOs to provide us with information on how many portfolios they're going to be submitting and in what areas those are. And we will provide that information to the panel chairs, and that will assist them to finalise their panels based on the EPs that they're getting in the subject areas.
Right. So researchers can be rest assured that we're going to have the expertise in place to assess their work.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that is important for staff members to consider is that we primarily appoint people based on their expertise at assessment. So while obviously we are covering the subject areas that a panel is required to cover, the fact that someone can look at scoring descriptors and make a judgment on quality is the primary decision for appointing people.
Okay, great, thank you. The next thing we're going to talk about is extraordinary circumstances. These used in the previous rounds, these were called special circumstances. We've changed them to extraordinary circumstances. And well, basically, I'm going to turn over to Amber now to talk through this.
Yeah. So as Sharon said, these used to be referred to as special circumstances, and through a consultation process, these have now changed to extraordinary circumstances. And there are three obviously key things that you need to think about if you've been affected by circumstances, is that there has been an impact on the quantity of research, not the quality of research. That the circumstances have to have occurred over a 3-year period, but those 3 years don't necessarily need to be continuous, and more than one circumstance can be claimed. Okay. So we do have the two different types that we've set out there. So there are general circumstances, which are long-term illness or disability, extended personal leave, and significant family and community responsibilities. And so those are the three that could be chosen from. You could choose one of those, or all three of those. You may be affected by the Canterbury earthquake circumstances, which obviously there are impact types that are listed under that. So some people may have the general and the Canterbury as well.
And there's lots of, at the TEO guidelines, which are published on our website, they have a lot more explanation and examples of types of those as well, don't they? Go into a bit more detail.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot more information there, and also instructions on sort of really how to complete the section in terms of, there is a comment section or a commentary section, but really the main thing to talk about is the impact that on the quantity of research because of the circumstances, not necessarily about the circumstances themselves.
Right, that's right. That's really between the researcher and the TEO to discuss and maybe the details of the circumstances, but so it doesn't really come to us, does it? We're interested in how it has impacted that research quantity.
Yeah. That's the information that the panel needs to make a decision.
A question. This gets asked a little bit actually. Is part-time employment counted as an extraordinary circumstance?
So it was in previous rounds. It is no longer in this round. So, however, if you have one of the other circumstances, so for example, long-term illness, and you, as a result of that you were part-time, you can put that in the commentary section. But part-time is not a circumstance on its own. However, we have made allowances within the portfolio to address your employment status if it, if it's relevant. So you can put this in your platform and research contextual summary section, and we also have made a change to the portfolio so the panel members will actually be able to see someone's full-time equivalent.
Okay, oh, that's useful. Right, so you just mentioned the contextual summary, and that's what we're going to talk about next.
Yeah. So, the platform of research contextual summary, that is a mouthful.
Yeah, it is.
So, Sharon, can you sort of, talk a little bit about, what the section's for and how to sort of complete it?
Right, so this is not really a new section. It just used to be called other comments in previous rounds, and we didn't think that gave it the significance that it should have, because it is a really important section. So the purpose of this is really to tell your research story, who you are as a researcher, your employment status and so on, what you're doing and what your research is about. So it's an opportunity for you to explain how the pieces of your research link together, the research environment that you're in, and we know that there's a really wide span. There are people who are in highly specialised research programs, and there are those who are really in environments where the focus is primarily on teaching, for example, with no postgraduate research programs and so on. So you can explain that there, and you should explain that there, really. Any changes in the focus of your research within that period, certainly if you've changed areas or context or subjects, put it in there, and the range of other research outputs completed but not in the EP that indicate the breadth or depth or both of the research platform. And there's some really useful guidance in the panel-specific guidelines for what individual panels might be looking for in that section. Yes, so think carefully about that one, and I think it's a really important one to write well.
Yeah, I mean, think of it as telling your story about who you are and what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay. The research outputs. Amber.
Yeah, so in terms of, selecting your research outputs, I mean, the research output component is, really important. So what's some advice that you would give to people around selecting which research outputs to put in there?
Okay, well, what do you have to think about here? You have to think about eligibility, and you have to think about the quality. So, eligibility, does it meet the definition of research, obviously? Was the final version first made publicly available between the 1st of Jan 2012 and the 31st of December 2017? So that's the date that the final version appears in the public domain, and that's really, I guess, that might only get sticky at the sort of ends of the assessment period, right?
That's right. Yeah. And and one of the things that people can do if they do have sort of questions around that is obviously check with the library or even check with the publisher if if you have got an output that is in that those windows.
Yes, and you have to be a little bit aware too that it might go into the public domain before it's included in a journal, for example. There could be early online access. That means it's publicly available. So that earlier date, it's possible that could catch people out. So it is important to know that.
Yeah, that's right.
That would be if it fell, but in 2011, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, the next consideration there is, can these outputs be audited? And that means the actual research item must be available. It can't be just a summary, a mention, or an abstract for auditing. And for NROs, obviously they need to be available for assessment as well as audit. Yeah. So your TEO will work through that with you. The guidelines have got lots of details on how to determine that and what sort of evidence is required. It also talks about traditional and non-traditional research outputs. And quality. With quality, what we're talking about here is really, do they reflect the standards set out in the tie point descriptors. I mean, what makes an A, what makes a B, what makes a C, and so on, and the quality category descriptors. So there's a guide called the Assessment Guidelines, and it's available also on our website, and that goes through all of those descriptors. That's a really good thing to read and have a look. And the other one is the panel-specific guidelines. What are they looking for? What does good look like for each panel? Okay. All right, moving on to completing the NRO fields. Who's going to talk about that?
I'm happy to talk about that.
Okay, well I'll just I'll flick them through.
So I think one of the things to remember here is that some of the information will be done by your organisation, and other bits will be quite key for you to actually input into those. So for example, your TEO will manage some of the things like the component IDs. Obviously, some of the bibliographic data that goes in there might be pulled from your research assessment system. They will upload what we refer to as the main research object and the supporting objects. That's the kind of information that the panel members actually directly access to look at quality. It's one of the things that is probably quite important for individual staff members to think about is this field called preferred order, and the how the research is ordered, or how the research outputs are ordered in your portfolio, is how it's presented to the panel. So nothing happens between the sort of submission process and the assessment process by TEC to actually change anything there.
Okay, so if you want them to see something first, you should put it in first, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and again, as Sharon talked about, you talked about at the beginning, with the confidential research outputs, there's a flag, associated flag for nominated research outputs that indicates that, you know, if you have got a confidential research output, then, you know, this is the one, and those are all handled in a different way. So those can't be uploaded electronically. They have to be you know, dealt with in a particular way, managed by your TEO and by the TEC to ensure that the information remains confidential.
One of the things that people have asked about sometimes, Amber, is when we're talking about the URIs, they, you know, some of the guidance that we've been giving people when they've asked. So I think it's important to let people know that you've got a link in there, that's okay, but that should be a link directly to that object. It shouldn't go to some sort of landing page, or they, you know, the assessor, the panelist shouldn't have to jump all over the place to find it. In fact, that's not okay, and nor should they require any passwords or so on and so forth to access that object.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, you know, you have to think about, you know, the best format to actually upload evidence of the output. So if you're, for example, if you have a composition and you decide that it's best for it to be in an audio format, then that's what needs to be uploaded.
That location there, that little field can get people as well, and I think there's been a little bit of a misunderstanding about it, but the location is for if it's a hard copy, isn't it, or if it's an object, you know,
that's
a statue
right.
or something.
Yeah, I mean, it could be, you know, a sculpture somewhere. But yeah, so location is usually is only referred to as the, you know, location of the hard or physical copy of something. So that gives it's important that staff members understand that you can't have both. So you can't you can't upload some electronic evidence and then say that you need to go and see the sculpture and
it's one or the other, right?
Yeah.
And if you're putting in that location and information, again, the place, make sure that it's really clear and obvious to where that is. I mean, we don't, not just a town name, for example. Yeah. Okay, great. Just following on then, the second slide from the same topic, quality assured, the year available, and the output source.
Yeah. So again, you know, a lot of this information will come from your organisation's research management system. So the year available has to be obviously within the assessment period. Output source is one that gets people a bit confused because of the name, but essentially it's bibliographic information that isn't already included in things like the title and the authors and that kind of information. So it might be pagination, journal article, journal name, I should say, that kind of the publisher details.
Okay.
Or, if it's a non-traditional output, it may be, a series of information around, a performance's venue and that type of thing. But each of the panel-specific guidelines do provide a little bit of information around more of the non-traditional side of things. So particularly in the creative and performing arts area.
Yeah, that for quality assurance as well. That's what I was just going to say. I was going to direct people to look closely at the panel-specific guidelines, particularly for guidance on quality assurance. Each panel has contributed a part about quality assurance, so read those for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, the last thing that we just wanted to talk about with NROs is the individual contribution. So this, you need to complete this whether or not the work was co-authored or co-produced or not. So if it was just you, you'd put sole author, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, it's quite important, this field, because, and this is where your input really comes in, because you need to describe what your role in the research was. And then, if you are a sole author, that's easy. If you're a co-author, then you do need to think about, the relative contribution that you've made and outlining that so it's nice and clear.
But what we want to know is sort of what you did, not a percentage. So not I did 40% of this. It's more about, I wrote this, or I collated the data, or I analysed and so on, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, a question about joint research. If there are several contributors to a piece of research, can we all put it in our EPs?
Oh, totally, yes. So, I mean, again, as we said, the quality of the research output is evaluated in each case on the basis of that person's stated contribution. So, whatever your co-author or co-producer's stated contribution is, has an impact on the assessment. So, I mean, while co-authors and co-producers don't need to be formally aware of each other's submission, if they've all submitted the same things, that's fine. We do actually encourage you to cross-check your details with their details. So just making sure there's no conflicts. And it's one of the things that we found in the last quality evaluation round. Often when people were putting percentages in, you get more than
everyone had done 90.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, yeah, so that's good. Get your story straight.
That's right.
Okay, the last part about completing the NRO fields is the description. So what's that for, Amber?
Yeah, so the description field is really important for individual researchers to actually think about and input into, because it's about the nature and significance of the output. So why was the output selected? Some of the other information in here might relate to the nature of the quality assurance process, but this is mainly in cases where it's not standard within the discipline for this type of output, or where the quality assurance process is varied or is not easily recognised. So some of the information, could be a description of the research content, or how the output meets the definition of research where it's not sort of immediately evident from the output. So one of the cases of this is textbooks, which are usually considered non-eligible as a research output, but in some cases that may be. So you're going to have to really clearly describe why it meets the definition of research.
Right. Okay.
Again, you might need to put in a description of any new research material or aesthetic refinement undertaken during the assessment period if there's been an earlier version of that output. And then again, any other information specific to that research output type. So yeah, it is really important that you are not make any assumptions that the assessor will automatically understand. If it's not standard within the discipline,
there's your opportunity to point that out.
That's right. Yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, now we have the other research outputs field, or the OROs as they're known. So the OROs, you can put up to 15
12.
Sorry, 12. 12 ROs, but that's only if you've included 4 NROs, right?
That's right.
Yes.
So you can't put in 2 NROs and say 10 OROs. You have to put in 4 NROs, and then
you get to put in
your 8. Yeah.
Okay. So a component. Yep. So it's really pretty much the same as what we just talked about, but I think the bibliographic details description field we probably should talk a little bit about, shouldn't we?
Yeah, because it is slightly different. It's not the same as the description field for an NRO.
Right. So it's really here, you're just putting in relevant bibliographic information here and so on and so forth. You're not adding, so which is, you know, author and all the stuff that you would normally put in bibliographic information, but no additional comments such as information about the quality or significance, right?
That's right, okay. Yeah. I mean, most of this information would probably come from a research management system. So, yeah, so but again, as we said with the NROs, there is also a preferred order with the OROs.
Same thing there.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one of the other things that's actually a little bit different from last time round is that OROs need to be clustered by type.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So we have changed the types previously for research outputs. There were 31 types. We've condensed that down. And so what we would expect to see is, for example, if you had 12 OROs and you wanted your number 1 ORO to be a chapter in a book, then if you had any other chapters in a book, you'd have to list those next, and then you'd go through like that. So you don't need to order them in terms of, alphabetical or anything like that.
Right, just cluster same types together.
Just clustering same types, yeah.
Great. Okay, so the next part is the research contribution fields. So this used to be, am I right, Amber? It used to be, we had 2 things called peer esteem and contribution to the research environment.
Yes, that's
and they've been merged.
Yeah, so they've been merged together and also expanded to include any impact that someone's research has had outside academia as well. So there are 2 new types that that sort of speak to that particular
What
aspect.
Are they?
So that is the uptake and impact type, which has a particular focus on the contribution that the research has had outside of academia. So that could be, for example, impact on policy or business processes or products.
Okay, so essentially is it making a difference out there?
Yeah, that's right. And the other one is around outreach and engagement. So this is more a focus on the contribution that the staff member rather than necessarily the research has made on the wider community. So it could be something like outreach activities, media coverage, that kind of thing. So,
okay.
Yeah. So even though they're sort of both focused on wider impact, the one's sort of more focused on the research while the other one's more focused on the researcher.
Okay, I see. All right, just the mechanics of it all then. So there's the component ID, the research contribution type. I think there are 12 types altogether.
That's right, yeah.
That's where I got my 12 from last time. Preferred order again and description. And just so this is 30%. The research contributions make up 30% of the total EP grade, with the research outputs being 70.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, I think one important thing to note, Sharon, is that if someone has participated in the quality evaluation previously, the peer esteem and the contribution to the research environment sections used to have 30 items as a maximum each, so 60 items maximum. This research contribution section has a maximum of 15 items.
Okay.
Yeah.
So choose your best. Choose your best.
And also, I think one of the other things is try to condense them down. So we've actually extended the description field so that people have more of an opportunity to really kind of get into the explanation of what they're doing. So one of the one of the types that can be submitted is student factors, and this is where if people have had any kind of supervision of students, in their as their contributions, they can actually merge those together if they want to.
Okay.
So they can just list out, how many. So, and that's what we encourage with the different the different activities where it's possible, you can actually put more things into one item. So you might not list out every invitation that you got, but you might cluster your invitations into one research contribution item.
Okay, yeah. So I think that actually relates to a question that was asked about research contributions. So I presented my paper at 3 different conferences, which were all during the assessment period. Do I choose just one as a research contribution?
Yeah, so I mean, again, we've allowed for flexibility really. So I mean, depending on the nature and the significance of the events, you can choose to submit one or multiple research contribution entries under one type. So I mean, it really depends, on each researcher and how they want to put their portfolio together, how they want to present it really.
Okay. And one more question about research contributions and evidence. So for assessing the RC component, is hard paper-based evidence needed?
No, so no, you don't. Paper is not required.
We don't like paper, do we?
Yeah, but what you do need to do is ensure that you've kept the evidence or information that you've used to make decisions about these things, the things that you submit. So, the auditors will contact your organisation and they'll identify quite early the sample of research contributions that are going to be included in the audit. So that's just a randomly picked sample. So each TEO will contact staff if there isn't information, available in, say, a research management system or the like. And there'll be time to actually gather that information together.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So, I guess final advice from us then to all you researchers out there, ask yourself, does your EP show your best research? Does it tell your story clearly and cohesively? Does it reflect the standards set out in the tie point and quality category descriptors? And have you followed any specific panel advice? That's as much as we can tell you at this stage, really. There's plenty of resources to help you. And these are all available on the TEC website. There's the staff guide, the panel-specific guidelines, the TEO guidelines, and the assessment guidelines. So plenty of good reading there. Obviously speak to the person in your research office. If there are any questions they can't answer, then they can then bring them through to us and we'll work with them to try to answer those and sort out any clarifications. I don't think we have anything else much to add, do we?
No.
All right, so all the best and ka kite anō.